So what actually is slicing? I like to say is the way that we talk to the 3D printer. So if you've got a model, let's say it's my coffee cup, and for us to communicate to the printer, we need to slice up our model into small incremental parts. And then that's how we communicate our words. Each layer is almost like a word. And then when you build it up, it forms a sentence, and then you send it to the printer and then it can understand it. Slicing is almost like a cooking recipe where there isn't just one correct recipe. It depends on what your goal is. If you're looking to make a dish that is more sweet, you'll change the settings, you'll add more sugar or something like that. Whereas if you're looking to prioritize, say with 3D printing, quality versus speed, you'll change the settings to suit your goal. Now, for some prints, you'll just want to be prototyping it. It's something that you want done quick, you want it done cheap, and it's just to prove a concept. So you'll have certain slicing settings for that. If you are prioritizing a print for an art piece, it's purely aesthetic, it doesn't need to be strong, you'll have other settings for that. And then for strength, maybe you don't care if it takes a long time, you just need it to be super strong and reliable. Well, then you'll have some other settings for that. So a nice starting point is the standard settings, but I like to change them just a little bit. And although each print may require slightly different settings, you can actually just get away with a nice default starting point a lot of the time if you're in a rush, and you don't always need to dive into every single setting to achieve your goal. So I'll go over what these are, but the one setting that I always put on by default, I'm actually not sure why it isn't on by default, is the Arachne wall generator. I also like to lower the infill a little bit. 10% seems to just produce less waste and still achieve a really strong print. I like gyroid for the 3D fill that it has, but that's just my personal preference really. And then I pretty much exclusively always use 0.2 millimeters unless I'm printing something super small and it needs that added detail. But this is a nice place to start. So why I turn on Arachne. So on the left here, you can see the classic mode, and this is what is default on Bamboo Slicer. And this is a bird's eye view of a slice of the letter E. And you can see that the orange outline here is the exact same width throughout. So this means that these little gaps in the middle of the E will fill in the white sections here. And this takes more time, and it also doesn't look as nice because to produce this white part that's really thick here and then really thin there, it's not too easy for the printer. Now, Arachne here changes the outside orange part to fill in that gap as it's doing it. So it's super efficient and it solves this thin feature problem. If you're printing text or just any object that has thin features, it really does make a big difference. I'll show you where that is right now. And I'm in Bamboo Slicer here, and you just go to quality, scroll down, or you can search it up too, but the wall generator here, Arachne. I don't touch any of the other settings, I just leave that on. And if you wanted to, you could just save this now as your 0.2 standard Arachne. And then you never have to remember to do that again. So that's the one setting that I always use. Now, with the fill here, I mentioned that 15% is the default, but I like to lower it to 10%. And you can change that by coming to strength here and changing this to 10 right here. It's in the strength tab. And this one comes down to what you're printing. Bamboo probably sets this as a default because it's safe. It'll create a strong part for most geometries, but it does end up taking quite a bit longer. Essentially, there's no correct number here that goes in for every print. If you're printing something large, then it becomes super important what you put in here. And you should really think about it a lot more if it's large, because the print time and the material usage is almost exponential for a large print. And for a small print, if you look at a Benchy and you change this number from 5 to even say 50%, it doesn't make a massive difference. So this is really something to consider for large prints. And if you're printing something small that really needs that strength, maybe it's some sort of hook or something like that, then you can really ramp up the infill without it affecting too much of the time. So the infill is one way to adjust your strength and the time it takes. Now, another way is the amount of walls that you use. So by default, Bamboo Slicer here, if we go to strength again, sets it to 2. And this is a nice safe bet for pretty much most prints. It doesn't use too much filament. It doesn't take too long. So 2 is a nice starting point. If you need that added strength, you can go to 3 or 4. And for some prints like a cake topper where the model's quite flat and there's a lot of infill, you don't even need 2 walls. You can get away with just 1. So that's when you might want to balance the two and say, okay, maybe I'll up it to 5% infill, but add that added wall in so it's more rigid on the surface. So let's move on to another big area which causes a lot of problems for prints, which is the first layer settings. These are 3 points that will most of the time solve your first layer issue. The first thing that you need to make sure is that your design has a nice first layer. So this one here has a really nice first layer. It's nice and big. There's no problems there. If we were to look at a benchy, for example, and let's say for whatever reason I wanted to print it this way, then no matter what settings you have, how clean your bed is, how much glue you have, it's not the most efficient way of printing. You're relying on such a small surface area to glue your print to the bed. It's just doesn't really make a lot of sense. That's why it's one of the main reasons why we print it on this way. It's the biggest flat surface. So that's the number one thing to look at. Now, once that's sorted, you then want to come back to these 3 points. One thing that you can do is use a brim if you're having problems with adhesion. Now, this is especially important if you're printing an object with square corners, as they can cause warping. So to enable a brim, you'd come over to others, and it's on by default to auto, but a lot of the times it doesn't actually come up. And even this print here, it's prone to warping. So to solve this is you can come to your brim type and change this to outer brim. And then you can even play around with this brim width. I'm going to leave it on 5, and you can see it adds material to the first layer. Now, what this does is it increases the surface area and then in turn increases the amount of stick that it has to that first layer. So this will create a more reliable print over time. Now, there are a few other things that you can do. There's this new one called mouse ears, which you can enable by changing this to painted. And up here, there's this little brim ears button. And we mentioned that warping will occur at the corners. So it's almost not too important to have the brim on this edge here. So if you just wanted to apply a brim to the corners, you can actually paint on your brim like this. You can see now, that's how you can apply a brim to a very specific area. Maybe your print has all curved corners and then there's just one corner that just keeps warping. You can target just one area with the brim. So, okay, let's say you try a brim and you've got a nice flat surface, but you're still having some problems here. I've had parts that I printed lots and lots of times and got a brim on them and they just keep coming off the bed. And I remembered I tried everything and then I just cleaned the plate with some warm soapy water and it just worked. So a clean plate can sometimes solve your first layer problems. Now, if that is still having problems, then that's when the adhesive spray is sort of like your Hail Mary fix for bed adhesion. Now, the slow first layer, I'll show you why this is quite important. This is especially important for prints where the first layer is the star of the show. So that'd be something like a light box. So a light box is centered around the film. Maybe this isn't the exact best model, but let's just say it's printed like this, right? And this is what everyone's looking at for the print. This is the important part of the print. So if there's a little area around here that doesn't stick well, you're going to notice it. And when you shine light through it, it's going to highlight that even more. And I've printed a bunch of light boxes. And one way that I solved this was by reducing the first layer speed. And this is something that improves adhesion because when you print slowly, the layer has more time to actually stick to the bed. And that means that each line that's being deposited will be more accurate. You can change this by going to your speed and changing these here. Now, I'm going to recommend going for 30 and 30, and it'll take some extra time, but from my experience, it makes a world of difference. Now, it can also come in handy for some small parts like this. And if you reduce the speed on these first layers, it might only take an extra 10 seconds, but it just adds that extra bit of oomph to your first layer. So those are the settings that I use to increase first layer adhesion, and they should solve all of your problems. Now, the next part is support settings. I've got a few pointers here, some that you probably haven't even heard of before. So with the support settings here, before you add supports, can you cut or rotate the model to avoid supports? Now, this example on the bottom left here, the blue is the printed part and the yellow is the support. This is just an example, but you can totally solve this problem by just rotating it and printing it on this face. So before even looking at the support settings, do you even have a support problem in the first place? In this case, no, you don't. But if you do need to use supports here, by default, again, support is not actually on for bamboo slicing settings. It's actually off. So this is one that you always want to have a look at. And it's quite easy. You can just turn it on like this. Now I'm going to go back to another model to demonstrate this. Maybe we'll use the Bugs Bunny here. So this model, because I'm downloading the model, it does come with support. You can't always trust every model that you download. So from experience, you start to learn that this requires some support here. For most models that you're going to print, tree supports are the one that you can default to and feel confident that it's going to work for most models. So you can just leave it on tree support auto and you can try it first without any of the other settings on. Now, when you don't touch any of these other settings, it generally puts more supports than you might need. This is the safe approach. If you just leave it unticked and don't touch any of these other ones, this is the safer approach. So some models, when you turn on supports, it'll just put on so many supports that it doesn't feel right. Like it's overcompensating. So what you can do is tick this support critical regions only, and this can make a massive difference to the time taken to print and the amount of material. So if you're ever shocked by the amount of time it's going to take, you can turn this one on, support critical regions, and reassess and make your decision from there, which one is the most appropriate. So if we have a look here, we should see a big change in the amount of support. And you can see here, it's actually decided that the ears can be done without support. When we zoom in, the trade-off that you're making here is that you might get some drooping on the ears. But if you don't care about that, then the trade-off might be okay. So even here, you might get some drooping. It's just something that you'll have to sort of test and look at yourself, and really depends on how important this model is to you. But that's a nice one to play around with. Now, I've done some prints where the supports have come off the bed and ruined the print. So these tree supports here are playing a vital role in the print. Now, for this, the way that it's auto-generated these ones is actually pretty good. They're nice and thick. They look like they're nice and robust, but sometimes they're not. And they play a critical part for the print, but they come out quite thin. So you can actually change this and make your tree supports more reliable. Now you can do that by, when you're in the support setting here, there's this setting here called initial layer expansion, and it's -1 by default. Now it's not immediately obvious what this setting actually is, but essentially it is a brim for your tree supports. So using this one as an example, this is quite a small contact patch here. If you printed this 50 times, this might come off 5 times out of the 50. So you can change this setting here. Let's just put it on, say, 8, and we can see now that it'll add a larger brim to every tree support. And this can save you a lot of headache. I've had a lot of prints fail just from tree supports coming off the bed. And it took me a while to find this setting. I didn't even realize, but you can see now, it's added that brim to the tree support, and it's added it to all of them. And if you're printing something that's, 16 hours, a long print, it's sometimes just worth using this brim setting here, and it'll save you heartache. So one other tree support setting that is quite important is the thickness of the trees, of the branches. So by default, where are they? They are over here, tree support branch diameter. Now, by default, they're on 2, which means these sections here are around 2 millimeters, or these sections here. So you can change this if you're running into problems where your tree supports are snapping off during the print. So let's change this. This make a big difference. We'll 3 times it. So we'll go to 6 and reslice, and we'll have a look at the new supports that it's generated. And this is, something that as you start to print more and more complex parts, the automatic default settings sometimes don't cut it for you or aren't very reliable. So finding these little settings here to say, thicken this, the supports might be slightly more difficult to take off, but with the added brim and the slightly thicker trees, you're going to make your prints so much more reliable. So those are the main tree support settings that you need. Now, it is worth noting that there is another type of support that has sort of been forgotten about now these days, and it's the normal one. For this model here, I wouldn't use it, but it does come in handy for models like this, which just require a very simple and flat overhang. Using tree supports for this is not ideal, and I would actually go for the normal supports. Whereas for something more complex like the bunny or this spiral, that's when tree support shines. So it's just worth noting that as well. Now, what else have we got? So we've got some settings to control the quality here. The main ones are layer height, outer wall speed, and just speed in general, and the seam, which is, I've forgotten this so many times on my prints. And when I would be printing with the glass 3D printer, the seams were really obvious, and where you position your seam was super important. So yeah, that's one that can easily be forgotten. So let's have a look at that, at those ones. With the layer heights, I highly recommend changing them with this tab here. And the reason why is right now we're on 0.24. And if we look at the speeds, if we go to the large one, 0.28 extra draft, and we look at the speed here, let's have a look at outer wall is 200 and sparse infill is 2. But if we change this to 0.08, that's the total opposite, or the smallest that we can go. The outer wall is the same, but then the sparse infill is a massive difference, 150 millimeters per second. So the reason why is when you print a smaller, when the nozzle is pumping out less material, there's less load on the nozzle and all the components, but essentially you can print faster when you're printing a lower layer height. And when you're printing a larger layer height, you need to reduce the speed. So you wouldn't really want to change your layer height right now and change this to 0.28 because you've carried across that extra speed that has been preset here. So you want to be sort of careful with this. That can probably cause a lot of issues with under extrusion and things like that. So ideally, if you want to change your layer height, you start off in this process tab, and then you can fine tune your other settings from there. So that is how I recommend to change your layer height. There is also the adaptive layer control, which we can go into on another video, but the outer wall speed and the top layer speed is one that you can use to optimize your quality. And this also touches on the light box point that I was talking about before. I needed that first layer, essentially the bottom layer, to have the best quality possible for the light box. So that's why I slowed it down. If there's one thing that you're going to take away from this point, it's that printing slower increases your quality, your print quality. So if you have a print that looks like this, let's just say it's a box, some sort of keychain, and you've got someone's name on it, and the top is the star of the show, then you don't really care about the first layer speed being on the faster side. It's a reliable size of this glue. You've got a brim. You're confident that it's going to work. You can leave that first layer speed and instead focus on the top layer because this is what people are going to be looking at. So to change this, you can head to speed here. And if you're ever not too sure what to change it to, you can just go to, or roughly half. Let's just go to say 60. That's a little more than half. And it'll take that extra time, but it's the same effect, but applied to the top layer. It's these lines that are printed here will be deposited slowly and have time to set and fuse and give that a really nice finish compared to if the printer was rushing it. And that's why maybe sometimes you have that, you might have your top layer come out not so nice. Now, this can also be applied to the outer wall. So the main ones here that we're talking about are the top layer, the outer wall, and the bottom layer. And these are the ones that people are looking at. So the infill, that's why the infill over here is generally one of the fastest printing speeds because you don't see it. So it doesn't matter if it doesn't look very clean. So if the side was really important and this profile was extremely important, we can apply the same approach here and go outer wall. It's already quite slow here, but maybe you want to reduce it even more to 40. And now that outer orange perimeter will have a slightly better quality. And this is something to think about, and it's especially important for silk filaments. If you're using one of these silk profiles, it's got that shine to it. And when you print fast with the silk filaments, they actually produce a more matte finish. And when you print slow and hot, they produce a more shiny finish. So that this point is really quite important for that, for the silk filaments. Now, the last point for quality is the seam positioning. This is something that is quite important, not so much for the box here, but if we are printing Bugs Bunny is probably another good example. So we can open that up again. The reason why I'm reducing the color here is so that it's faster to slice, by the way. So with the seam positioning, by default, it's in the quality tab and it's on, and this is a nice default setting. A lot of the times it'll work for you, but it is important to know that you can change this. And I'll give you a few tips here that may come in handy for some different designs. So we see here with aligned, you can actually see the seam in this, when you're in line tab, it's the white dots here. So I'm turning them on and off so you can see. Now, aligned is a clever way of doing it because it hugs the edges. So the seam is being put in the corner where you won't actually see it. But then the seam is being applied here, which you will see. And it's front facing. So you might not be a fan of that. And you might, what side of the print is the star of the show? If the front is the star, you might actually want to put it at the back. So you can click here and change it to the back. And this is just a small, subtle detail that a lot of people won't really notice, but now there's no seam from the front and it's just put at the back. So that's one thing that I regularly look at is I either go between aligned and back. Now, another one that you can do, which is sort of a bit more of a weird one, but you can set it to random. But the thing I don't like about random is that it makes it look like the print has a bunch of zits everywhere, which it doesn't come out as apparent in the slicing program. But when you print it, you'll notice little dots everywhere. You can actually set it to random. And then up here, there's a seam painting setting. And I've done this in the past. It's worked for some models. And you can increase your brush size. You can actually click to either apply a seam or right click to block a seam. And what I've done in the past, I think it was with some of the glass prints. So I set it to random, and on the star of the show, which is the front of the print, I don't want any seams. So I would block every seam at the front and color it in and quickly go over it like that. And what this is essentially telling the printer is don't put any seams at the front, because these areas that I'm coloring in now are super important. But the back, I don't mind. Or maybe even this part. I don't want it to be there either, or on the side. And then when you click on slice, the printer will go, all right, I won't put it at the front. I'll put the randomness at the back. So now you don't get that line, but you get those zits at the back. And it's a trade-off. Sometimes the line is better, or sometimes the line can look nicer. Sometimes this process can look nicer. So that is one that a lot of the times I personally forget, where I optimize every other setting and then I forget about the seam. And that is really the main points here. So just to summarize, Arachne, using that on every print is recommended. See if you can reduce your infill if possible. The walls, balance your infill with the amount of walls that you're using to optimize strength versus print time. Brim is one to consider, supports an outer wall. That is it. I'll end the webinar over here and we can transition to the Q&As.